In August 2024, two Italian soldiers were cut out of the ice on Marmolada. Their collar tabs pointed to the Como Brigade on the Italian side of the front. Their names were gone. They were buried as unknowns, 108 years after they went into the ice. I started looking into this because I wanted to know what they had been doing on that mountain in 1916. There was one morning that put more men into the ice than any other single moment of that war. Wednesday, December 13th, 1916. The Austro-Hungarian camp at Gran Poz on the Marmolada Massif lost 270 men in about 30 seconds. The mountain has been returning them ever since. Some came back the same day, dug out of the deposit by rescue teams. Others were recovered the next summer when the ice finally melted. The last group is still being recovered more than a century later. The story starts in August 1916, when the Austro-Hungarian army built a camp on a stone shelf high on the Marmolada Massif. Around 321 men were stationed there: Alpine troops, officers, command staff, and Bosnian supply porters. The shelf sat below a wide rock wall that ran across the mountain face at 7,356 feet. Above the wall, the slope tightened into a collecting bowl. Snow on the upper face all drained toward one notch directly above where the men were sleeping. For the war the army was actually fighting in 1916, the position made sense. The wall blocked Italian artillery from across the valley. The shelf could be supplied by cableway from below, and taking the terrain cost lives. As long as the threat came from the valley, the camp was correctly placed. The threat that finally killed it was already above the camp, building in a form Division Command had no procedure for. Beginning on December 5th, a system of warm, wet Mediterranean air stalled against the Alps and started loading the upper Massif. The loading went on for 9 days. In the worst loaded sectors, more than 8 feet of new snow fell. On the summit terrain above Gran Poz, accumulated depth reached between 26 and 39 feet. By December 12th, the snowpack directly above the camp was roughly 20 feet deep, heavy enough to crush timber. But weight alone was only the first part. Snow stacks in layers. Each storm leaves its own. The seams between them hold only by friction. Liquid water running along one of those seams can dissolve it. When it gives, everything above releases as a single piece. Captain Rudolf Schmid commanded the Gran Poz sector. He was the officer who would be standing under the loaded bowl the morning it came down. By the second week of December, he could see what was happening above his camp. He submitted a written request to evacuate the position. It went up to Division Command. It was refused. The decision was made by officers who weren't standing on that shelf. The records on this part are uncomfortable. Schmid was right. Division Command had a war to fight. Artillery vectors, supply, terrain. Men had already died to hold. They were working from the evidence in front of them. The disaster came from a chain of command working correctly inside a threat model that didn't include what was building over the camp. There is no clean villain to point at in this story. That took me a long time to make peace with. By December 7th, an earlier avalanche had taken down the telephone lines from Gran Poz. The supply trails were buried under successive snowfall. The cableway down to Pian Trevisan was the only working line out. The camp was being cut off from below. At the same time, it was being loaded from above. On the night of December 12th into the morning of the 13th, the weather changed once more. The temperature rose. The rain line climbed the mountain. Below about 6,500 feet, rain fell directly onto the snowpack. At Gran Poz, sitting higher, the precipitation came as warming, wet snowfall. The water seeped into the pack and ran along one of the buried hard crusts. The friction holding 20-plus feet of snow above that boundary started to dissolve. Sometime between 5:30 and 6 o'clock in the morning on December 13th, the friction failed. a section of the mountain on the order of 35 million cubic feet with a mass exceeding 200,000 tons released into the bowl above the camp. The bowl bent the path of the slide before impact, turning the force sideways. The mass hit the camp from the flank. What reached the camp arrived in stages. A slide that size drives a compressed wall of air ahead of itself, and the air hits the ground before the snow does. The guest barracks at Gran Poz was empty that night. Field Chaplain Martin Matzneck had been billeted in a smaller shelter further down the slope. According to Matzneck's later testimony, the air blast alone threw the empty barracks roughly 1,600 feet across the mountain. The avalanche itself had not yet arrived. The slab arrived behind the air. It hit the reserve quarters first, then pivoted laterally through both command posts. It broke the porter's barracks into splinters, reached the dressing station at Baranchi, and damaged the cableway. The deposit was what remained when the snow stopped moving. Wet avalanche snow doesn't stay soft when it stops. Friction during movement briefly melts the surface, and when the mass stops, the melt refreezes immediately. What remains has the density of poured concrete. About 270 of the men in the camp never came out alive. Eugenio Mih, an ethnic Italian fighting under the Austro-Hungarian flag, was asleep in a multi-tiered wooden bunk when the roof of his barracks collapsed inward. The heavy beams that should have crushed his chest came down at angles that crossed above him. Where they crossed, they left a triangular pocket of air around his head and shoulders. His left arm was pinned. His face was clear. He could breathe. The soldier in the bunk a few inches to his right was outside that pocket. He was dead before the beams stopped moving. Mih came out alive because of how his bunk happened to be sitting when the roof failed. The geometry decided it for him. Within hours of strike, rescue parties were riding the cableway up from Pian Trevisan into the continuing storm. Secondary slides were still releasing from the same bowl. They cut into the deposit with shovels, then with picks as the snow hardened. About 7 hours after impact, they reached Captain Schmid alive. He had minor injuries. Lieutenants Gatti and Kofler were pulled out of voids near the command structure. 25 more men came out alive by the end of the first day. Schmid survived and was brought back alive to the same command structure that had refused his request. After the first day, the work slowed. The deposit hardened. The rescue became recovery. By the 5th day, the search was being wound down. There is no precedent in modern rescue for surviving 105 hours buried in a set avalanche deposit. On the evening of the 5th day, near the edge of the deposit, the snow opened from the inside, and a soldier walked out. He was wearing a torn shirt and socks. The skin on his hands was worn raw. When the slide hit his section of the barracks, the structure had been thrown backward against the rock face behind the camp. The collision left a dark cavity beneath the deposit. He had survived the impact and found himself sealed in absolute darkness under roughly 20 feet of compressed snow. In a complete burial, breath is usually the first killer. Water vapor from each exhalation strikes the freezing snow inches from the face and crystallizes. A frozen mask builds over the mouth and nose, and the buried man suffocates on the ice he has produced by breathing. A larger cavity delays this, but then cold takes over, and exhaustion and dehydration. He had a pocket knife. For more than 4 days, in absolute darkness, he worked upward from the wall of his cavity through set avalanche snow, carving a vertical shaft toward the surface. He cut himself out of his own grave with a folded blade. The Austro-Hungarian engineering records remember him only as Der Eiserne Kerl, the Iron Man. His emergence pulled the dig back open. By the evening of that 5th day, rescuers pulled 8 more men alive from the same edge of the deposit. After the first week, what came out of the deposit was bodies. Most of the dead at Gran Poz were not recovered in December. The deposit had hardened past what picks could break. The main mass of the slide stayed in place until the summer thaw of 1917, 7 months after impact. Some of the dead were never recovered. The slide had carried them into the body of the glacier itself. A glacier is a slow, frozen river. It carries what enters it for centuries. Gran Poz was the worst single strike of that morning, but it was part of a wider avalanche cycle. The same weather system was running the length of the Alpine front. Avalanches released across 48 hours into positions on both sides. The event later became known as White Friday, though December 13, 1916 was a Wednesday. Modern reconstructions place the total death toll across both armies at roughly 2,000 men in those 2 days. Bodies kept coming out of the ice for the next century. In August of 2024, the Guardia di Finanza recovered 2 soldiers near the saddle of Forcella Serrauta on the Italian side of the Massif. They used ice axes. The bodies were placed in wooden coffins, draped in the tricolor, and lifted off the mountain by helicopter. Their collar tabs identified the unit. Their identification discs were too damaged to confirm names. They were buried as unknowns. Schmid's camp at Gran Poz was Austro-Hungarian, opposite sides of the same mountain in the same war. So the 2 soldiers recovered in 2024 were not Schmid's men. They belonged to the other side of the front, but they belonged to the same mountain that had already taken his. At first, I thought this story was about 2 unknown soldiers pulled from the ice. It wasn't. It was about the mourning that could still reach them from more than a century away. I don't have a clean place to leave Gran Poz. Schmid's request is still in the archive. Most of his dead stayed in the glacier until it dissolved, and some never came out at all. Last August, 2 more men came off the same mountain. No names, just uniforms, damaged discs, and a mountain that kept its evidence frozen for 108 years.